So welcome everybody. This is our third talk. My name is Joe Davidson. This is personal contact number 3, and I am part of Durden and Ray, the art collective that is in the Bendix building in downtown Los Angeles. Personal Contacts is a show that we put together, as most shows are right now. They are these kind of responses to what's going on with COVID, with how do we see shows, how can we like get out and do things, and how do we engage our community? And we just brought on a show called Here We Are, We Are Here, Here We Are, which was a show that was placed where we placed artwork and invited over 100 artists, and everybody put artwork all across Southern California, essentially. And on the heels of that show, we decided to do another somewhat experimental show. So Personal Contacts is a sort of faster turnaround show where we have 25 members or 24 members in Durden and Ray right now. And we are doing 2-week shows where 4 members of Durden and Ray ask other artists that they respect, that they have like a kinship with, for whatever reason, they ask the artists to come in and we do pairings. So our show tonight for Personal Contacts will be starting tonight with, starting with the Durden and Ray artists. We have Allison or Allie Woods, who has invited Maria AGUREEVA. And our second artist is going to be Arzu Bartanya, who has invited YASMINE DIAZ. And then third for talking tonight will be myself, Joe Davidson, and my invited artist is Samantha Fields. And then fourth and final is Valerie WILCOX, and her invited artist is Michael PROVART. So we are going to be having relatively quick 15-minute conversations with each of our artists. I will let you know that the show right now started last Saturday, so it was up on Saturday. It will be up again on September 5th, which is next Saturday. The times on that are 12 to 5, if you'd like to come, or if you'd like to see the show separately, we can try to make arrangements with you. Go to the Durden and Ray website, durdenandray.com, and then contact us there. And then hopefully we will be able to arrange a time for you. So let's start right now. So we have Allie Woods, who is interviewing Maria AGUREEVA. Now this first interview, so everybody knows, is a taped interview, because Maria actually right now is in Moscow. And Allie, I forgot to ask you, is she on residency right now, or does she live in Moscow?
She's living there.
In Moscow. And so because of the time difference, it would just made more sense for Allie to interview Maria. And we're going to start with that. And then after that, we are going to listen to Arzu.
Hi, my name is Allie Woods, and I'm here today with Maria AGUREEVA in Moscow. And I first encountered Maria's work at the Spring Break Art Show, where she was exhibiting a piece that I could best describe as a radioactive lime green mixed media sculpture. I was exhibiting in the adjacent booth with colleague Sean Noyce, and he told me that he knew Maria personally. So when this opportunity came up, I asked Sean to make the introduction. And one of the reasons why I was interested in Maria's work is I prefer a pairing that's not necessarily so obvious. So Maria's work is sculpture and my work is painting. And I think it creates some interesting but unexpected relationships. Both of our works are based on the concept of artificiality. In the case of my work, it's artificial intelligence. And in the case of Maria's work, it's the artificial body. For this, I love a painting titled Science Junk, which deals with technology and its cultural ramifications. I had worked on a series of paintings using only gold paint last year. This painting came out of that series, and it's something of an outlier in that it is not a gold painting. It deals with color, and it has sort of an explosive, pinky, fleshy element in a sea of detritus that can be interpreted in a number of ways and seems somehow relevant in our current times. I paired it with Maria's untitled piece, which deals with corporeality and the design of the body, and artificiality and body armor. And Maria, how would you describe this work and your choice of materials?
Okay, hi guys, thank you for watching this. Thank you, Alison, for introducing me. I would like to tell you about my two works, which I show in the show, Personal Contacts. They are from series In the Folds of Your Body. I refer to physical changes in the human body when people resort to changing themselves, improving themselves in pursuit of an ideal image, ideal conditions of their body. People polish their own image just as people polish billions of images on the internet. But in the process, they do not notice how they lose their own identity and individual features that makes us special.
For those who've never seen your work, how would you describe it and what materials do you use?
I combine together different contrasting materials, such as sometimes it can be beeswax, latex, sometimes I use wood and rocks and so on. In the second synthetic part, it should be glossy, smooth plastic. And sometimes I can use neon and synthetic fabrics. Especially, I choose contrasting materials for sculpture to create the dialogue between two materials, because the natural materials like beeswax, it refers to human skin. And it's so pliable, so soft material. And the second part, artificial plastic, it refers to the process of self-design, how people change their body, how they modify their body. And it's the surface of the plastic, it's so smooth, so ideal, without any flaws and distinctive features. A beautiful glossy surface attracts attention but draws away from the essence. This is only a mere attractive shell. This is concept about my two works, which represented in the show.
And do you work with other people or by yourself?
Sometimes I can invite some people, some helpers. When I work with heavy and large sculpture, and sometimes when I work with performance or video installation, I can invite for collaboration a musician. Last year I had two amazing performances with live sound. One of them was in LA, it was at Coaxial Art Foundation, and the second was in Moscow. You can see the two photos from the performance. Name of the performance, Passing. I got a prize and I was able to realize my performance at the art fair, Kosmoskor Art Fair in Moscow. And I created part of my body, and during 1 hour I used several sanding machine, and I completely destroyed the piece of my body. It turned into dust. You can see the pink dust on the table. And during the performance, musician created sound sculpture. It was dialogue between us. I destroyed the sculpture piece of my body, and he created sound sculpture. It's like dance life between dance between life and birth. And it's still about my topic, which I work about self-design. Yeah.
So you work both in Moscow and Los Angeles, and Los Angeles, as you know, is a big body-oriented culture. So how is your work affected by where you live? And what is the difference between your practice in Los Angeles versus your practice in Moscow?
Of course, my work floor is greatly influenced where I am. When I was in Moscow, I was working a lot with the topic of attitude to the body, feminism, attitude to female body, self-design, precisely because in Moscow there are still completely complicated and controversial questions. I often integrated this is my own life, and I couldn't help reflecting. When I moved to LA a couple years ago, I started working with environment. It seems to relax and started to look around, and I started working with the intersection of body and environment, because LA is surrounded by national parks and very various nature, and that influenced me, because when I sorry and in my works, an important aspect when I work with the theme of environment is the annual wildfires. I use burnt wood, pieces of wood, which I found after wildfires. In these works, these traces of fire on pieces of wood, like scars on the human body, which keeps their personal history. And you asked about difference between Moscow and LA, attitudes to body. I can definitely say that there is a difference in attitude toward feminism and the female body in Moscow and LA. I had really interesting conversation with Anu Vikram. She's an curator and an art critic from LA. She wrote an article about my art and my performances, and she wrote in this article interesting words. I would like to read it. Moscow in 2015 being in a similar context to what an American artist would be dealing with in the New York art world in 70s. I think the way in which sexism in contexted in the American art world today is somewhat different, not completely, but somewhat different. But that good old-fashioned sexism is looking a little bit more gloves off. The way that things are done in Moscow, I'm totally agree with her. I will give a really interesting example. Yesterday, I saw an advertisement for an app for meditation. In this advertisement has there were two videos. The first shows only very beautiful girls with bright makeup, with idol bodies, who were meditating while sitting with their closed eyes. closed eyes. And in the other video, which also advertised this app, a man in a business suit walks through an office, and in the end of the second video there was a slogan about meditation after hard day at work. This is 2020 Moscow. The female body is still used like a commodity. It seems to me that the situation with the female body and feminism is changing, but very slowly. And it is happen only in big cities. Feminism is not interrupted correctly, and because of this, there is no trust in Russian society. I want to say that situation in Moscow has changed since 2015, but not radical.
So where do you get your inspiration?
I'm inspired by a lot. Sometimes it can be people's attitude to their own body, changes in body associated with aging processes, natural beauty, individual characteristic of the body, physiological processes like childbirth, the relationship between human and nature. I'm inspired by environmental changes as a result of human activities. These things encourage me to start thinking about topics that are related to these processes and things, and leads to the emergence of new works and projects.
So that brings me to my final question, which is, how is it working in these times, and how do you think these extraordinary times will affect your practice?
Listen, it's for me it's a little bit I don't understand it, because when the quarantine just started, I was working and absorbed my in my new video installation, and I was editing my new video installation during 3 months, and now I'm starting to come back to my regular life, but I still spend a lot of time alone because I'm busy looking for new materials for my new sculpture. Of course, the world around me is changing. My solo exhibition was postponed in Europe, was postponed to next year, but I just continue to work and do my job.
Well, I want to thank you for participating in this project. It's really exciting having you here from Moscow, and I'm really excited to be able to share, and here's a few more slides of your work, your projects with us here all over the world, actually. Thank you so much.
Alison, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be part of this project. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ali, is there anything else that you'd want to say after having interviewed Maria? You're on the spot.
I'm muted. I thought she was a really interesting person to interview, and I thought her practice was really interesting. I kind of wished I could have shown that sculpture that I referred to in the beginning, and I also would have liked to have had a piece of her sculpture work that referenced the California fires where she was using burnt wood. I think that would be the only thing I could add to that.
Nice. Okay. All right, so how about we'll move on. So next up we have Arzu Bartanya, who is going to be interviewing YASMINE DIAZ. Yeah, I guess that's it. Arzu, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Arzu Bartanya and I'm here with YASMINE DIAZ. Hi YASMINE, great to have you with us tonight.
Hi, sorry, I had to unmute myself. Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure. So I saw her installation a couple of years ago at Women's Center for Creative Work. I was drawn to her installation and could easily connect to her work as I could see many connections and similarities between her work and mine in terms of concept, materials, details we both use, which I'll go through them here. So starting with my work, the piece I have in the show is titled Home, and it's from 2019. My work reflects the experience of creating a home while existing in a state of in-between. It's a narrative formed through layers and gestures that blend my childhood and early adulthood in Iran with my current life here in Los Angeles. The space I occupy is navigated through the bodily experience of womanhood and a balance of dichotomies like public, private, psychological, and physical environments here, there. In Yasmine's works, in her work, navigates identity, gender through the lenses of a US-born Yemeni American girl. She uses personal and cultural histories as the source material for her work. She's a multidisciplinary artist whose practice navigates overlapping tensions around religion, gender, and third culture identity. Her recent work includes immersive installation, fiber etching, mixed media collage, using personal archives and found imagery. DIAZ has exhibited and performed at spaces including the Brava Theater in San Francisco, the Albuquerque Museum of Art, and the Torrance Art Museum. She's a recipient of the California Community Foundation Visual Art Fellowship of 2019, with works included in the collection of LACMA, UCLA, and the Arab American Museum, National Museum. And she lives and works in Los Angeles. And so beside the concept of our work, one other similarities between our work is that we both use fabric and transfer images, but each of us do that in our own way. I use the transfer images of photos that I've taken myself of LA and my hometown. Here in LA, I take pictures of my neighborhood. Same thing with Iran. When I go back to Tehran, I take pictures of our neighborhood inside the house that I grew up in. And she uses photography as her reference material, so sourced from her personal archives, as well as those she has collected from other Yemeni American women. Okay, so with this introduction, I would like to jump into our interview with Yasmine so she can elaborate on her work. The first question is, could you please tell us about the concept of your work and the ideas behind it?
Yeah, so the two pieces that I have at Durden and Ray are part of a series of work that's upon work from the last 3 to 4 years. And this work started as more directly autobiographical, and it's in the form of mixed media, or how it started, mixed media collages and installation that essentially has been telling parts of my own story and background. And this is something that I did not at all beforehand. I would never really talk about myself or refer to my upbringing in my work. It's quite loaded and complicated to tell. You know, essentially sort of self-estranged from most of my family for a very, very long time. And it was not something that I had any desire or was ready to do for a long time, basically until I was. And just to kind of summarize that quickly, you know, in the years post 9/11, there was so much conversation around like Arabs and Muslims from both sides, if I'm gonna, you know, simplify it to two sides. And, you know, as somebody who had kind of a complicated background, you know, with my own upbringing, it was like very frustrating because I was seeing like, you know, essentially these very polarized kind of conversations, like Arabs and Muslims are, you know, either viewed as like terrorists and, you know, barbarians or whatever, the enemy. And then also sometimes from the left, what was frustrating was that like this kind of simplified narrative too that like, um, they kind of flattened, I feel like, narratives about like Arabs and Muslims. So like, I was raised with Islam, and from a young age, I knew that I was agnostic, like before I knew that word, right? So I had a very like, challenging relationship with religion in general. And those were the voices that I wasn't necessarily hearing about. And I also felt like maybe those voices were even kind of silenced to some degree. Like, I'm progressive, I'm a leftist, those are my values. But also I felt like there was this sort of like unwritten kind of, maybe pressure to not talk about that, because it's like, this sort of like, don't make us look bad, sentiment, because it's now's not the time to talk about these things. So I think for a lot of women who come from marginalized communities, there is this pressure to not talk about like the particular kind of like misogyny, that we're experiencing in our communities, because it might make us look bad, and we're already dealing with xenophobia, right? And so I just got to the point where I couldn't not talk about these things anymore. So with the initial so I had been painting for a long time, but not really showing my work, not really like trying to make a career. And then like got to this point where I wanted to maybe, share a bit more of an autobiographical, thread in my work. And that's when I switched to, I started with collage. And with the initial body of work, and even with the most recent work, I've essentially focused on adolescence and coming of age. I've become kind of fixated on it. But specifically, as a child of Yemeni immigrants, this kind of like, girl becoming a woman period, and focusing on the issues of, talking about like being raised within multiple cultures and the challenges and the tensions that can result from that. And these are things like in, all the conversations I've had in the last few years through sharing this work, are challenges and tensions that, are experienced by, I think, immigrants, children of immigrants of many backgrounds, particularly those who are coming from collectivist cultures, like those coming from the global South, who've migrated to more individualistic cultures, like, the global North, West. And so, so the two pieces that are in this show are fiber etchings, and I made them as I was making a large body of new work for a show called Soft Powers, which is currently installed at the Arab American National Museum in Michigan. And so this title, Soft Powers, I'm sort of like redefining this term that's normally used in diplomatic relations. But I am redefining it for the purpose of the show and this work. I liken these powers to a kind of superpower that is, at least that's how I see it, that I've experienced and witnessed, that I think people who have grown up in multiple cultures develop, right? So these powers or these skills are something that start from a young age. So just like how I think all children start developing certain kind of skills, some would even say like, learning how to manipulate like their parents, right? Like, who can I get what from, kind of thing. And I think that for children of immigrants, like, those skills are even more nuanced, because not only are they learning how to deal with different adults, but they're learning how to traverse like very different worlds, like at home and outside the home. And getting even more narrow, I think, for girls, especially girls who maybe are growing up in quite, like cultures that are particularly gendered, we really kind of have to, maybe refine skills even more. And that was definitely my experience. And so, we may be a little bit more surveilled by the adults in our community. And I think that can come from this sort of like communal obligation to protect young women. And there's a fine line, between protection and control, right? And, and I think within diasporic communities, that incentive is like even stronger, because like, you know, we've migrated to this new place and we really need to like watch out for our girls, right? Which can sometimes have harmful, unintended harmful effects. So the fiber etchings, I decided to focus on these moments when we as girls were amongst each other and not have to worry about who is watching or surveilling. So all the source material for these etchings are photographs. They're either from my albums, family albums, or for this show, this was the first time I started talking to other people outside of, you know, my own family, but Yemeni American women. And I was focusing on the 90s, which is when I was a teenager, when I was in high school. And yeah, most of these photos are us taken of each other. So like this one that you can see on the screen right now is my sister, and she's putting on lip liner in the mirror. I recognize this bottle of Maxima. I don't know if anybody remembers what that is, but it was like a cold cream that was popular in the 90s. And that was on the shelf, so that hence the title Maxima and lip liner. So these like seemingly kind of like mundane moments that, you know, may have been like in the bathroom or the bedroom, but basically, you know, these moments where we didn't have to worry about who was watching, that were really kind of important to us, you know. And the other one, I don't know if you can click to that one, but it's just, that's my other sister. So like kind of like adjusting her hair, and the pattern in the background is a very common you know, pattern in you know, an Islamic geometric design that you'll see on tiles and other kinds of decorative patterns and, you know, clothing or things like that. Okay, that was a very long answer maybe for that question, but
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the other question I have for you is how your style and practice changed over years. Because when I saw your work a couple of years ago at the Women's Center, it was this one, you know, the room full of all the, you know, personal belongings with all those neon lights, you know. But now you're doing the fiber etching. So I was wondering how, you know, your practice has changed to the fiber work.
yes, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I was doing, I was focusing mostly on painting. And then when I decided to kind of shift what I was doing with my work, it's like completely different now. I don't have any of those paintings on my website. Sorry, it's so dark in here. This room doesn't have any light, so I just have this like weird lamp. I knew I needed to use a different medium, and so I just happened to go to this collage night, and it was at the Women's Center for Creative Work. And by the end of the night, I hadn't done collage really at all, maybe since I was a kid. By the end of the night, I had like made, you know, like maybe like 5 or 6 collages, and I like didn't recognize like the work as like my own. It was essentially like, you know, it was very liberating, and it was very playful. And I hadn't felt that feeling in a very long time. And that's when I knew like that was a good medium, you know, that was the medium that I wanted to use to start talking about things that were very difficult for me up until that point. And I think that collage is kind of an interesting medium. And I see installation as a kind of a form of collage, you know, in the same way that you're taking imagery from different, like maybe disparate, you know, source material. You're doing the same thing, maybe with, you know, items and objects that you find and put together in a space. And I think as like a child of immigrants, there's kind of a parallel there. Whereas like you're taking things from like these different sources, different places, and forcing them to live together in a space, they might be ill-fitting or kind of don't belong together. I feel like that's how many of us feel, like we don't belong here or there, you know, like I'm not Arab enough for Yemen, I'm not like whatever white enough for the US, you know. So I felt like it was a very kind of fitting medium to talk about these things. And with installation, you know, I had, there were a few installations by other artists that I'd seen in the years, like right before I did this one. This is the first installation, the one that was right on the screen right a second ago. And those by like Genevieve Gagnard, Guadalupe Rosales, and like Pepon Osorio, they were also very personal, and talking about very vulnerable things. And when this residency came up, I knew I wanted to do an installation because of how much those other installations resonated with me. I think that installation is such a wonderful way to kind of like bring somebody into a space, you know, invite people to kind of experience like this very intimate world. You know, like I think, you know, like this is a very nostalgic space. And I think like that's kind of the first thing that sort of hits people, like, oh, look at this groovy wallpaper. And, you know, I put in the carpeting, the wood paneling, you know, the wallpaper. I really wanted to create this world that's like cozy and inviting, but you, upon like, you know, closer inspection, you will discover details that kind of complicate the space a little bit more. So there's a few documents on the wall in there that talk about, you know, some of the more, you know, difficult things that like I was experiencing at that time. So for example, I changed my name when I left home, and there's like, you know, the name change documents on the wall there, some correspondence there from, you know, these are all from my actual files of a friend of mine who's helping me, you know, to find legal help. And so you know, I was really stressed out when I was making this because it was like, it was a lot to share. But essentially the space, you know, I didn't want to hit people over the head with like, oh, honor violence and like forced marriage of things, but like by creating the space that was familiar in so many ways to a lot of people, I think, even if it wasn't their nostalgia, you know, it was maybe disarming them first, and then they could, you know, like, oh, this is not so unfamiliar to me, you know, because I think the fear is that, you know, I'm playing into a stereotype, or you know, I'm feeding a stereotype. These are things I did experience, and they're true, but like I don't necessarily want to add to the xenophobia. But if I can first bridge that gap by building a familiar space, maybe it won't seem so distant to people, you know. Anyways, I thought it was a very effective way to kind of talk about these things, and I felt okay, you know, with doing it that way. But yeah, so
I was just going to say we have
you
about a
can.
minute. Sorry, we
Sorry?
just have about a minute left. I just wanted to know. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I knew I was gonna. I'm sorry. Okay, I can.
Still have time, Joe, you said, or we ran out of time? Joe?
He's
Yeah, I'm here.
1 minute left.
Oh,
So.
1 minute. So, okay, so my last question to you is, can you please walk us through your process, you know, because you do this amazing fiber, you know, fabric etching. Can you just, you know, quickly tell us about the process?
Sure. So, so this process, which I call the finished work fiber etchings, but it's also known as dévoré or burnout fabrics, and essentially, the process involves applying an acidic paste to the fabric. In the case of these works, it's silk rayon velvet, and it's then activated by heat, and then the rayon, which is the fluffy pile, is literally etched off. And so what you're left with is an image that's both transparent and opaque. And I wanted to use this process for several reasons. Burnout fabric, I think more people would be familiar with its use in clothing. And it was popular in the 90s, which is the time period that I focus on in this work. And also in the images, thanks Edis for including those photos. Those are photos, so one is from my family album and another is of these other Yemeni American friends of mine, but they're wearing a very traditional kind of Yemeni dress. And burnout fabrics were, you know, very commonly used in those dresses, especially in the 90s. And so that was like another reason why I wanted to use it in this work. And I think that tension between like opacity, you know, and transparency is something that I think it kind of relates to like adolescence, especially for like these people that I'm thinking of, you know, where we're kind of like struggling with ourselves and like what to share. You know, I think a lot of us, like that's when we start to like keep things to ourselves and really kind of discern like what we're sharing with maybe the adults in our life and what we're keeping private. So, okay, I don't want to take up too much more time.
Thank you
But
so much. No, that was amazing. Thanks for sharing all your, stories, and that was amazing. Thank you so much.
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
Great, thanks, Yasmin. Okay, so we are at our halfway point. I just want to remind everybody, if you're coming in new, you're listening to Durden and Ray's Personal Contacts number 3. The next show coming up is Personal Contact number 4. And the Artist in Personal Contact number 4, we're going to have Ty Pownall, who is going to be showing with Jane C. Mee, Joran Bosen, who's going to be showing with Gretchen Bacheller, and Stephen Volkov, who's going to be showing with Theo Svenningsson. So that is going to be installed this weekend. The first show is going to be a week from Saturday, so I think that is going to be the 12th, I believe. And I'm not sure what the date is on the interview for that. It'll probably be, I think, on the 14th or the 15th, but there'll be Facebook invites and Instagram invites coming out on that. Okay, so coming up next is myself. I am pairing with Samantha Fields, who is a painter here in Los Angeles. One of the interesting things about asking Samantha, hold on a second, I'm just gonna put my timer on. One of the things that's interesting about asking Samantha if she was interested in the show is I actually don't know Samantha, and we have not met. I know her because of her work. I know her because she has actually a very strong online presence, which I respect. She's always like putting ideas out there. She's putting opinions out there, and she's always, she's got such, to me, like this amazing intellectual curiosity, and it sort of comes through, at least online, through her Facebook and her Instagram presence. And we have had an overlap in places that we've shown together, which is also really interesting. So Sam originally is from Cleveland. And Sam, are you with us right now?
I'm here. Sorry, I was muted.
So Sam is originally from Cleveland. And Sam, you moved out to LA. When did you come to LA?
I came out here in 1998 to teach at Cal State Northridge.
So you came out here for a teaching gig, which is great. And so what I first wanted to kind of start talking about, one of the interesting things that I was thinking about is, what is it about Sam's work that I really respond to? And how does it sort of fit in with the kind of work that I'm doing so that we could have this conversation going on between each other? And Sam's work, the way I think of it is they are these sort of exceptionally executed canvases that are sprayed. So they have this really strong sense, they have a really strong sort of photographic sense to them, while she's also playing with like how we're kind of perceiving the photograph, which I think is interesting. In terms of a lot of the work that I have seen from her, there's a lot of kind of disaster, catastrophe situations that are going on with her work, which is sort of combined with these sort of overlays of what I consider to be like celebratory imagery. So we have like balloons and confetti and these things that, I mean, interestingly, on the end of the two things that we had, the two political, what's the word? Sorry.
The spectrum.
The two conventions that we have with what, were traditionally these big kind of celebratory, displays of propaganda. She's using all of these in her things that are then sort of contrasted with images of destruction, usually environmental destruction. And how I kind of feel sometimes that fits into my work is I end up thinking that my work is, and I wasn't really aware of it so much, but I think about the sort of like personal nature of my work. And I think about the work that I've shown that I'm showing in the show is, I have one plaster piece and one cast porcelain piece The plaster piece are balloons that I've cast in plaster, and they're sort of lying on top of each other. And Arzu, if you don't mind going back a couple of slides that we could take a look at that. And the other piece that I had, and so this is the balloon piece that I have, in which they're sort of piling up on top of each other. And and the show is, the piece is obviously called Pylon. And the other piece that I have are these speed bags that I just cast, which are the speed bags that you use, when you're boxing, and they're in this kind of moment of sort of decomposition. They almost look like figs or something that are falling apart and beginning to rot. And I think about the sort of personal nature of kind of what these things represent. And I think about those things as like a kind of metaphor for typical maleness in some way. And I'm thinking about myself being like a 50-year-old male who's kind of on the other side and going into middle agehood. And, like gravity is starting to take hold, and every day is much of this sort of like struggle against living in some way as you get older and older, as you get, as you like get injured, you don't come back as quickly. But I also think about like the imagery, particularly of the speed bags, of like typical masculinity. And with Sam's piece, what I was thinking about is, here's this sort of end game idea of living in a sort of hyper masculine world in which we go and we find the land, we take the land, and then we make the land do what we want it to do. And then after 200 years or 400 years of this is the kind of land that we're living in now, which is, we're dealing with issues of climate change that are showing themselves in massive fires that are happening year-round with us right now. So that's kind of where I was thinking of how Sam and I in some way are intersecting. So what I wanted to do is just kind of at the very basis, is ask if Sam, like, if that makes sense to you at all, and if we could just sort of talk a little bit about how you go about like making paintings and how you start thinking about coming up with imagery.
Yeah, sure. And actually, Joe and I, we met also kind of tenuously via the SIP art project that I created at the beginning of this pandemic.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I'll type it into the chat later, but I created an online residency program for my students and opened it up to working artists, and Joe submitted, and I loved his work. And I had seen his work before, so I knew your work. I just didn't know you, like so many people in the art world. And so when you asked me to do this, you were already in my head. So I was like, oh, sure. And the balloon imagery, as both of us using balloons as these kind of anti-celebratory images, I thought was interesting. Mm-hmm. And I definitely am thinking about, collapse and societal collapse and not just environmental collapse. So my work deals with disaster on a couple different levels, from ecological to political to personal, and how those things are intertwined. So when I was choosing the imagery of the balloons and the confetti, I was actually specifically thinking about political conventions initially, because if you cut everything out, like if you cut the people out, they look exactly the same. The conventions don't look any different, really. And but also the balloons are specifically from the Apple dynamic messaging campaign. When you text on your phone and you're like, happy birthday, and the balloons shoot out. Or if you say congratulations and the balloons shoot out. So I'm really interested in these kind of algorithms and how these things work, because you can also say like, congratulations, you're fired or whatever, you just lost your job, and you still get the balloons because the algorithm's stupid. It just recognizes keywords. So this kind of dissonance is something I'm always interested in. And these balloons are actually painted out of focus. So the way I constructed this image, they're pushed forward and pixelated. So I construct my images in Photoshop before I paint them, and then I print them out on an inkjet printer, which simulates the same way an airbrush works. So all of my work is made with an airbrush. I always think of myself as working from a real kind of intellectual remove from my work, because I don't physically ever touch it either. So I'm a painter who doesn't touch her paintings. I make work with that space in between. So those are all the things that are on my mind. But Joe, you're totally on track with all of those ideas. I don't think I had thought of the landscape necessarily as male dominated, but I suppose historically we do have to kind of think about it in those terms.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's super fascinating that, you know, this idea of the remove in your process, like the remove from like actually touching the work. I mean, in some way, like sculpture is like that too, or at least my process is. I'm a little bit more kind of involved in it, but I like to sort of set up these parameters and then, you know, sort of put things together and then let the piece essentially make itself. You know, you're doing work that is much more, I think there's like in both ways, in both instances, there's this kind of interesting sort of psychological remove from being like I feel like my work is not so much about like me. And I'm not sort of seeing that with you either. And I think we have different levels of remove that express themselves in different ways, but you're doing it through sort of spraying on the canvas and using, you know, using the imagery that you use, and then, but I was going to talk about foreground, background. I'll do that in a second. But this idea of like not touching the piece is kind of interesting, you know, and how we both sort of go about creating these things that, you know, you, like I said, you sort of set up the parameters in a sort of Dadaistic or like an art of povera kind of way, and let the piece sort of make itself and then respond to it and keep going with it. You know?
I mean, it's, I do exhibit an enormous amount of control over these paintings. I think the remove and the removal of the hand specifically is what I'm thinking about, because, you know, I'm painting epic scenes of disaster most of the time, and you can't really make work like that without having a direct relationship to romantic landscape painting, the Hudson River School, you know, and those oil paintings are so lush with the hand of the artist. And so this, using acrylic paint and using a mechanical means to make the paint, for me, that also separate it. I'm in conversation with those movements, but also quite separate from them as well, dealing with more contemporary issues. And also, in a way, I feel like we're all spectators in the landscape. Like the landscape, we go to the landscape and we're like, entertain me with your grandeur, or relax me with my, you know, trip or whatever. Like what we seek from the landscape is so much, and I feel like politically too, we are also spectators in a way. Like there's a helpless feeling of seeing all of these things constantly unfolding in the United States. And so I think that, to me, it's like there's this weird dissonance too between a deep personal interest and also a kind of remove. And I think you have that too. It's like this profound personal, and then this also just kind of pulling way back. So it's like that feminist saying, you know, the personal is the political. It's like they're always connected. There's no separation for me between what's personal. I find my work to be deeply personal because I care so much about what happens, you know, like, but a lot of this imagery really came from looking like back to when I was born and the collapse of, like, I love reading about the collapse of civilizations throughout history, because, you know, and hubris and things like that. So I think your deflated balloons really speak a little bit about hubris as well, you know, this kind of like, well, you know, collapse that happens in the balloons as they kind of slump over sadly. So I think that's really an interesting connection between us.
It's interesting, like I was wondering, like, because this work seems to me, like your work specifically seems so quintessentially like West Coast California, just in terms of subject matter and stuff like that. Also in terms of how you're thinking about our kind of perception of how we're seeing things. It's not necessarily Californian, but because we live in the area that a lot of the technology comes from, I think that's really sort of an interesting thing. I mean, one of the things about the piece that I asked for the show, Wish Fulfillment, is this weird kind of thing about these pixelated images. And as I was talking to you about it once, there's something about like when you're watching TV and the screen freezes, and then what you just got used to, like these kind of really fluid shapes that describe things that you perceive, and you say like, oh, it's a person walking into a room. All of a sudden everything gets jarred and jammed. And then you get this sort of like weird peek behind the curtain that it is just all an image, you know, and no matter how well you're rendering it, it's still like, you know, it's still a simulation in some way, right? which the Hudson River School people, you know, like that's what they were doing too, because their imagery, you know, they went out and they did plein air painting, but they also fucked with it. And they also played with like proportions, and they played with, you know, the construction of the painting so that it actually was coming out as something that it actually wasn't in real life. It was there to sort of create this thing. So that's what I find sort of fascinating about, you know, particularly wish fulfillment, but a lot of your work in general has that sort of really interesting kind of tension and contrast between sort of what you're seeing versus what may actually be real. So that's a really kind of nice thing going on, you know?
It's funny because I think I was telling you when we went to pick up the painting, when the web guy for my last show got the images, he kept sending them back and saying that they were out of focus and rasterized, and that like, what's wrong with this artist? Can't she take a decent picture of her paintings? And you know, the dealer kept sending them back, and finally he was like, oh, she's just kind of trompe-l'oeil painting digital noise and rasterization. And everybody's like, oh, okay. So I think it's also really funny to have this relationship with technology that when I put my work back into the technological realm, it looks like crap. I mean, my work looks terrible in print. It looks terrible online. It only really looks interesting, at least to me, when I see it in person. So like every time I have a catalog made, every time it's reproduced, I'm always like devastated. I'm like, oh, looks terrible. Nobody's ever going to understand this work.
It's the image that's up right now is when I first see it, and I look at it and I look at mine, and mine I can sort of tell, and it has like these 3D form to it. But when I keep looking at yours, it's so sharp and it's in focus, it almost looks like something that's been placed on there. And it looks like an incorrect image that has been like messed around with, and then we just sort of copy and pasted it on there. But then I have to like see the shadows and I feel like, oh, it's the actual thing. It's a really wonderful testament to the sort of like dexterity of your painting style. You know, it's this wonderful sort of, you know, it really is kind of messing with my eyes, and it's messing with how I'm sort of perceiving what's just in this image. So
it's funny you say that, because that's like actually how I made the image. I'm actually terrible at Photoshop. Like I'm a painter, like I'm not good at Photoshop, or I can cut and paste, you know, I can select some things. So it's always really crude. I mean, I make my compositions in Photoshop, but you know, it's always just got to be just good enough for me to have enough of a reference to construct the painting. So I never really bothered to learn truly how to do it. So in this, I really embraced like my crappy ability with the Photoshop and then painted that. So I'm laughing because that's like wildly accurate.
That's awesome. I hate to say it, but I think I've gotten through about like 4 out of my 25 questions already over time. So I am really sorry to have to cut it short, but I'm going to cut it short. So thank you, Sam. I really appreciate like your like participating in the show, and I'm so glad we got the chance to talk for a little bit.
I'm really happy to talk to you too, and thank you for inviting me. And it's really great to hear about everybody's work tonight. It's a treat. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, guys. So we're on to our last caller for the night. I feel like I'm taking calls in or something like that. Our last talk is with Valerie WILCOX, and she has invited Michael PROVART to talk. So Valerie, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Thank you, Joe. My name is Valerie WILCOX, and I invited Michael PROVART into this show, and we are so happy to have you part of our show, Michael.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We know each other. I think it's been about 6 or 8 years. We've been in an art group together. So we've seen each other kind of make work and evolve and be in process with our work and talk about it. So we're pretty close in our knowledge of each other's work, and we've always felt an affinity to each other's work as far as there's a relationship. There feels like a conversation with our work. We work in abstract forms. We're both kind of collagists in a way, and we just have we've traded art, so we really like each other's work. And so I wanted to give a little background on Michael first. He's got a bachelor's degree in painting and drawing from Cal State Long Beach. And then he moved up to Oakland, and he was showing in galleries and museums up in the Bay Area. and he was also doing some curation up there. Then he decided to pursue his interest in film and got his MFA degree with a specialization in production design at the American Film Institute. He's designed and art directed commercials, full feature or low budget features and music videos. And he now teaches production design at the School of Cinematic Arts at USC. And he's been doing that for quite a while now. I think almost 20 years or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've also taught at Chaffey Community College. You taught studio arts with drawing, painting, and life drawing. And we're so happy to have you here. I have quite a few questions. I know we won't get through them all, but I'm going to let you talk because you got a lot of questions, and we'll show my work along with yours. But I wanted to start with a question about how your interest in film has influenced your art, and film production specifically, or just film. So if you could talk a little bit about that to start, that would be great.
Sure. Well, my interest in film and the crossover in my painting was sort of a turning point for me probably 20 years ago. And before the works that I do now, I mean, it's changed so much over the years, but, I did highly realistic work. And at that time, it was very influenced by film, more specifically certain directors and things like that. Influence in terms of like composition, sometimes subject matter. Certain filmmakers, I like the way that they brought subtext into their stories and their films. So, then it was a little bit more direct. And then once I got into the film world and actually started working on productions and was in that world for quite a few years, actually doing production. At a certain point, I was still doing my painting behind the scenes. And at a certain point, I realized that maybe I'm not the person cut out for production per se. And I had an opportunity to teach, first at Chaffey and studio arts and things like that, because I love to draw. I draw a lot from the figure, still do. And, but anyways, I got a chance to teach, and there was a sequence of events in the film world that happened at the same time where production just sort of wound down for me. And I just found that, I really enjoyed being in my studio and just being with my work and just trying to create objects of interest. So.
Okay, great. So can you explain a little bit about the methods that you're working with, how the collage comes into play, and also your figurative drawing seems to be a large part of what your work is about, and abstraction of those different forms. I've seen your sketches. You do a lot of life drawing on the side with models, pre-COVID, of course. But I know that you incorporate a lot of that in your work. So if you could tell us a little bit more about how all that came together, that would be great.
So as I said before, I used to do highly realistic work, and it was, I've always been interested in collage, though. It's interesting, a number of the artists tonight talking about collage, and specifically, I like objects. When I go to museums, I always find myself meandering to the areas of, objects from a certain, culture or area of the world, and but collage is always primary to everything that I do, and just sort of bringing disparate things together. Having said that, the earlier work that I did that was highly realist really involves the, observation. And I would sit and do a lot of stuff live from friends and family and make paintings. So drawing has always been a really, really important part of my work. And I think it's something about, keeping the hand loose and the shapes and the forms that come from it. So updating it now, bringing it forward, I tend to, look at my drawing now less specifically about trying to capture a persona or a character or a sitter. I look at it kind of more about kind of a mark and kind of collaging of marks in a way to make drawings. And sometimes, not in every painting, but sometimes the drawings that I have up in my studio, I'll have maybe 20 or 30 drawings up as well as the paintings. And sometimes they just sort of move over into the other painting and just become part of it. And sometimes I'll turn a drawing upside down or other ways. And, you know, I look sometimes at drawings of the figure as landscape. And I also found in the days that I taught studio arts with students, it was an easy way to sort of bridge a gap for students to not feel this big monkey on their back about having to make sure things are absolutely right. And that if you think about a figure as a landscape, it was sometimes a way of allowing the students to work in the work, just to think of, like, you know, that the body could be boulders and trees and, you know, earth. And so I still think of that idea even when I'm thinking about collaging things together, is like how to take these different drawings and working them into the paintings.
Yeah, so we both kind of work with, there's a bit of a landscape environment aspect to our work, kind of things that come from the figure, but oftentimes do look like landscape. I think the method I take is salvaged materials, and that's another part of what you do a little bit too. I notice you take and stitch your canvases together a lot of times, and it looks like they've been pieced together from an older canvas somewhere, or you've taken that drawing and you've literally cut and pasted it or somehow brought it into your piece. And then this red cross, of course, I don't know what that's made from. What is that red cross made from? Is that like a...
It's literally paint and lightweight, it's what the golden medium lightweight modeling paste, I guess. Just
okay.
Mix up a large, huge bucket of it kind of thing. And then just, I had forms and filled it in, and yeah.
Okay, and then also in this piece, it's a little bit hard to see. I tried to show it in one of these pictures where it's actually, you've actually popped out the canvas from behind so that it's actually curved when you look at it from the side, which is, yeah, that shot kind of shows it a little bit. So it kind of plays with this idea of a skewed horizon in some sense when you think about the earth and kind of this horizon, but it's all skewed. And I love the fact that things are kind of topsy-turvy. Your figures are almost unrecognizable in some of your pieces, but because they've been turned upside down, and all these different angles creates a whole different meaning for it. Do you ever start a piece with a specific theme or idea behind it, or how do your pieces come about?
So I don't actually. It's more of a response and sort of addition. You know, I really like the piece that's in the gallery. That was a canvas that I got from a studio that was, somebody was closing down their studio across the way from me, and they were unloading a bunch of nice canvases, and I bought it for like $40. And, you know, it just started as a way to, sometimes I use the old image, sometimes I knock it out. Sometimes I, you know, then will just completely cover it over. And in that case, it was a metal aluminum painting stretcher bar. And I didn't like the way that the canvas would drape over it. And so I put wood forms behind it just to essentially, you know, stretch the stretcher bar again without having to pull off the canvas. And so the wood forms had a shape to them and had a sort of collage element, collaging it together. And then it just becomes a different kind of object. And then I paint on top of that. This painting you're looking at right now was years and years ago. It was actually a painting of a portrait of somebody sitting in a chair. And I just turned it upside down and painted this. I did this sort of smear thing after I saw the Gerhard Richter film about, like, when he's, you know, smearing all those great smears across the canvas.
Yeah.
I just realized I could probably do something like that. And that's when I got into the molding paste. I just try it, you know, and sometimes, you know, you crash the car, it doesn't work out. And other times, you know, it's perfectly fine. It's just part of it. And other times it sometimes brings you to another place, you know, with the imagery.
Yeah, I think we both like that, and that we've experimented with materials quite a bit. I'm always trying different things and to see how that's going to work. You don't see my failures, but it's fun. There's so much out there to play with, and I want to know if you've got a sculptural background, because it feels like there is that same sense of form in your work. And do you have any sculptural background?
So, you know, sometimes I think of sets as large sculptures. You know, it's interesting looking at, I'm sorry, I'm going to space on your name. It was, hang on, I'm checking our, looking at Yasmine's sort of installations, those pieces that she was making. I mean, she's very purposely, you know, putting each piece together, and it has a narrative in there, in those spaces. Sometimes when you're building sets, I like to convey to my students, they're like a large sculpture. You know, it's not only just about the architectural stuff that's happening within a set and providing things for your actors to move in and out, but it's also every little element that the set decorator puts in is all adding to the whole overall narrative of what a film might be about. But getting back to your question about sculptural background, for me, I'm always interested in objects. As I said earlier, you know, years and years ago in the late 80s, I had an opportunity, a really fortunate opportunity. I was living in New York City, and I was up on the Upper East Side working with an art historian. I would live there for about 6 months. I was literally on the same street. I'd come out and you could make a left turn and just walk to the steps of the Metropolitan Museum. And, you know, every day after work, I was also staying there. So I could just walk down to the Met, and I'd just park myself in an area of the Met for maybe a week or 2 weeks or whatever. I would just basically, oh, I'm going to go and look at the, you know, works from Greece today, or I'm going to go look at, you know, artwork from Alaska, or, you know, whatever it might be. But I was just really fascinated with objects that were made by hand. And, you know, when I lived up in the Bay Area, I worked at the Oakland Museum, and the Oakland Museum has a fantastic history area in their museum with all these fantastic artifacts. So anyways, I like to make things with my hands and work with my hands and create objects. So I don't know.
Well, that creates that crossover between your production design and the work that you make. And do you see yourself, how do you see yourself and your work moving forward? Do you see more of that or less of that? Or is there a direction you find yourself leaning towards?
Hey, Valerie, sorry, don't mean to interrupt, but we have about 2 more minutes, okay?
Okay, perfect. All right.
Michael, I also worked at the Oakland Museum in the 90s.
Oh yeah, wow. Oh wow, interesting.
I worked doing install in the 90s. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great place. But, you know, where do I see, you know, again, not all my work is sculptural, but, you know, when the realist work that I used to do, I failed to say this, but they were all collages. They were all built by little pieces of paper and sort of like marquetry on cabinets and furniture and things. My studio is kind of like a rat's nest. I used to just paint large sheets of paper with color, and then I would just go about the painting like a painter would. If I need a certain kind of orange, I'd find an orange piece of paper on the floor and glue it up. And part of that process, I realized that the sculptural aspects of the faces were getting sculptural. They're getting like low relief. So anyways, going forward, you know, it'll be about the next painting. I'm not quite sure what it'll have in store for me and where it'll lead me. I don't know if it'll be sculptural. I'm not sure if it'll be flat. It'll be, you know, large color field, open. I don't know. We'll see what happens. You know, that's the beauty of all this. It's fun that way. Just keep moving and growing.
Exactly. Exactly. And during COVID, anything that's changed for you real quick?
Yeah, I mean, for me, COVID is really, you know, it's thrown a wrench in my works. I feel a little inconsequential. I haven't actually been in my studio in 6 months, probably. You know, with all the suffering happening in the world and people's lives turned upside down and people dying in the streets and, you know, the political thing and just everything, it just, I feel really small. So it's interesting to try to make an image right now, to put together an image. For me personally, it's difficult. It's interesting. I don't really do political art per se, but this particular image that was in the show, the Red Cross, for me is literally kind of Red Cross, and it's kind of fractured. It's broken. And I think our society is really randomly broken, you know, so I don't know. That's,
okay, great.
yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. We really enjoyed hearing from you. And thank you, Arzu and Joe, for managing this, being the host. Is there any questions? Hang on, we got to see if we got some questions here. Let's see.
Jean Dunn said, thanks everybody, interesting work and fascinating conversation.
Last day to view the show is this Saturday. I'll let you finish up, but we, anybody want to hear more about my work, they can contact me. I just got a question, but I don't, that's okay.
Okay, great, thanks guys. All right, so that is personal contacts number 3. And like we said before, the show is open until September 5th. We'll be taking down the show then. Then personal contacts number 4 will be coming up. That will open up on the 12th. Thanks everybody for joining us. I think these are such great experiences. I'm so glad that we get to do this and just have these conversations with each other, albeit virtually, but it's kind of nice to be able to sit and kind of concentrate with each other, even if it's for 15-minute bursts of time. So thank you again. Everybody have a great night, and we will see you for the next interview.
Thank you for coming, everyone.
Thanks a lot, you guys.
Great to see you all.
Be well.